taking over as chair shortly because I have another meeting anyway, but I wanted to do the introductions before we move on. So basically, I would like to welcome our two speakers, Lara Wong and Sally Witchell, who will be speaking for 10 to 15 minutes each, and they will then be taking questions and contributions. Lara will be speaking first and will be addressing issues around mitigation. She's from the Clinically Vulnerable Families, and she's one of the founders of it. And then Sally, who has a long and CV, but it was latterly chair of the Scottish Commission on Social Security and has been doing an awful lot of work throughout COVID on disability issues. Is currently a freelance consultant, and she's been involved with the Zero COVID Scotland campaign and the COVID safety pledge. And she will be speaking second. Just in terms of a bit of housekeeping, which I'm sure if I forget anything, Noah will let you know. We've switched on recording. We had a long discussion in our steering committee about whether having recording on puts off people from asking questions. And so we're going to switch it off after the two speakers have finished their contributions. So if anyone is feeling a bit kind of, oh, I don't want to ask a question because I'm being filmed, it's not being live streamed. The recording that will be made of the first two speakers will not show the gallery view either. It will only show the speakers. So if anyone is feeling a bit intimidated, do please kind of bear that in mind. We don't want anyone to feel they can't ask questions and contribute because of that. There is closed captioning, and it helps us a lot if you use electronic hands to put your hands up. And something we were discussing just now, and which I shouldn't have done, but when the speakers are speaking, can you try and be on mute? Because it cuts back down on background noise and on feedback. So I would like to introduce firstly Lara Wong. As I said, she's from the Clinically Vulnerable Families, and she will be addressing in issues around mitigation. For myself, I'm both clinically vulnerable and disabled, so I'm really interested in what both speakers are going to say, and I hope I don't miss too much of it. So, as I said, I'll hand over to Noah, who will look after you from now on, and we'll deal with any tech issues that anyone has as well, because he's one of our tech experts. So thanks very much for everybody for coming. It's quite a good turnout for us. We seem to be still getting a lot of people interested in our campaign calls, even though we keep being told that COVID doesn't exist anymore, absolutely gone, no masks, no mitigations, and I'll leave that to Lara to continue.
Thank you ever so much, Jean. So as Jean has just explained, I'm from the Clinically Vulnerable Families group. We support various people with clinical vulnerabilities. So anybody who kind of qualifies for additional vaccines is more than welcome to come and join us. And anybody in a household that has clinically vulnerable families. So I'm going to share with you a presentation. I'm going to try and screen share. We'll see how we get on. Never any good at this. I apologize. Am I screen sharing?
Yes, yeah, it looks great.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Thank you. Right,
it's not,
so
it's not
sorry?
full if you want it to be. There you go, perfect.
Oh, okay, I think it was just catching up with me there. Okay, so yeah, we're Clinically Vulnerable Families Group, and we were founded around about August 2020, and it was initially due to the risks posed in schools, and that was basically because families were being told that they had to return to school, children didn't catch or spread COVID, as we know that's completely incorrect, and that you know, we didn't have anything to worry about. We only had to worry at times of shielding, and then supposedly people were protected, although obviously that was only the clinically extremely vulnerable. Clinically vulnerable people obviously were not at that time. And obviously the protections never went far enough. So yeah, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter and various other places too. So part of the work that we're doing right now is focused on mitigating risks, so reducing people's risks. And we're very aware that everybody has a different risk and everyone has their own tolerance to the risk. And so, you know, what is right for somebody else who may have exactly the same clinical condition as you, may not be at risk at all in the sort of clinical risk factors list, they should get to choose what is right for them. So this is what the government's told us: hand, face, space, and fresh air was the last thing that came along. Well, we already knew that, didn't we? So they told us to use face coverings. That was never good enough. They told us social distancing, cleaning hands. Yeah, it always helps, but fresh air is what we're focusing on. So that's, you know, we're quite sort of keen on those things. You may or may not be aware of the Swiss cheese model of defense in the pandemic. If you look at these items, many of these have already gone, and very much we are left with, as the government explains, personal responsibility. So, you know, we can continue to mask, we can test ourselves, we can, hopefully some of us can access vaccines, but we might not be able to isolate for the full length of time. Children certainly are being forced back into school after sort of 3 days. So that's a real concern. Sorry, I should explain also, we're not just about schools now. We expanded a long time ago to cover everybody. So face covering or face mask. Right, we would encourage people to consider using FFP2 minimum or FFP3 face mask. There was some research that suggested that some face coverings actually help to spread virus. So some of these sort of bandana type things are not ideal. So if you are covering your face, cover it with a real PPE mask, please. So you may or may not be aware that there was some research into mouthwashes. Now, this is sort of an additional thing. This is not necessarily going to make a huge impact, but there is evidence to show that the mouthwashes can reduce the amount of virus in the saliva. So some people will use it to try to sort of protect themselves if they feel that they're at risk. Some people will also use mouthwashes if there is COVID in the household. Other measures that we're using, nasal sprays. You may or may not be aware that there are nasal sprays on the market that can help against flu, they can help against colds. Some of them just sort of simply trap virus. Some of them may help to reduce infection length. In terms of sort of the ones that are commonly used in our group, quite a lot of people are using Boots Dual Defense. And there's something called a Novid, which we're finding really interesting. There's some good research on this, although there's not quite enough yet to sort of say that it's, you know, how strong it is, but it's looking really, really positive. And we would encourage people to sort of consider things like this. Hopefully in the future, it will be approved in the UK. It's currently approved in Germany and Israel and all sorts of other places around the world. And we hope that it comes over here soon. So this isn't ideal, but some people are quite concerned about times when they really can't mask. So if you're going to the dentist, you're not going to mask. This is something that sort of we've discovered through our group. These are nose filters. Now, at the end of the day, we're not really sure how effective they're likely to be. It's going to be down to fit, and you would have to breathe solely through your nose, which is probably unlikely, but it might reduce your risk somewhat. So it's about layers, and it's what you can do in the place. The thing we'd really like to sort of focus on, though, is clean air. And clean air is so vital, and I'm sure many of you are well aware of this. But Clean Air Stars is a fantastic website that you might want to use if you're looking at mitigating a particular space. It will help you to look at the dimensions of a room and consider how much air filtration you need to have per person in that space. And so, you know, ventilation outdoors is great, but we can open our windows if we don't have HEPA filters. Mechanical ventilation is fantastic as well, and we want to look at getting as many air changes as possible to decrease the risk of virus in the air. But air filtration, I'll show you sort of some one of mine later on. So some of you may also be aware of CO2 monitoring. Now, CO2 is not sort of a direct link to COVID, obviously, but it's a good model to use if you're considering the amount of clean air in a space. So if it's not a ventilated space, then you can look at the amount of rebreathed air, and you can use this information. So ideally you want to aim for 800 or below. So the lower it is, the better, the lower your risk. And if you've got a HEPA filter, then that's going to decrease your risk. So with HEPA, you can go slightly higher. And so, you know, it's just a proxy, but we can consider that. So HEPA filters, there are lots of different types of HEPA filters. They might only cost sort of £100, £150. There's lots of research to show that the level at Core 300 is very good. So lots of people in our group have been buying that one, but there's also Smart Air do lots of very good ones as well. And again, like I said, you have to look at your space. Air filtration is really important to do all sorts of things. So it will remove pollen this time of the year, so you can reduce your allergies. It will remove all sorts of airborne viruses and infections and pathogens, pollen, pollution, I don't know, and it will help you if you've got lung conditions or asthma. On the go, okay, so you can buy some mini HEPA air filters, or you can make your own. And actually, I didn't mention on the last one, that's a Corsi Rosenthal box in the middle there, which is a homemade HEPA filter. And it literally is just a fan and a filter. So you can make these, the one you can see there is a personal one that's made with like a computer fan. And you can carry them around with you. You would need to be pointing directly at your face. And you can see that where it says mass entrainment there, it's talking about sort of dragging some of the particles into that airflow. So it's not as good as having a much bigger HEPA filter, but you are reducing your risk, and that's what we're all about. So what we suggest, obviously outdoors, we like outdoors, but if you're indoors, you want to be wearing those high quality masks. You want to consider maybe nasal sprays or mouthwash. Lateral flowing obviously really helps. So it's not 100%, as we all know. But if you can encourage people to lateral flow if they're meeting you, and if you're meeting someone high risk. Clean air, you know, we can monitor our risk with CO2 monitors, we can limit our time in the space, and avoid sort of crowded spaces or small sort of confined spaces. So try to be careful if you're going into those tiny rooms with poor ventilation. That's where it's going to be sort of high risk to you. Infections in your home. So obviously, you know, cases are starting to rise again. And this is an ongoing issue. This is not a one-time, so once a year event. COVID, unfortunately, it's constant. So we have to constantly be on our guard. So once COVID gets into your home, ideally we want to be isolating people. And it obviously depends. If it's a child, then that's not always possible. But ventilation as much as possible, wearing high quality masks again, and all those other things we mentioned, and try to not sort of share things with people, and test regularly, test until negative. So that's sort of the end of my presentation. I don't know how to unshare. You can unshare me. Okay, thank you. So I'll just quickly show you. So I mean, I've got sort of personal HEPA filter, and I also have sort of, you know, a mini one of these. So it kind of tells you how much sort of the CO2 level in this space. And obviously it's just me in here, so it doesn't really matter quite, you know, as long as it's not going to an unhealthy level for CO2, then it doesn't matter. So, but it's worth kind of carrying around with you so you can have an idea of your risk, particularly if you're going somewhere that you're concerned about, like healthcare, which is a real concern for us these days. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. That was brilliant, Laura. Right, I'm going to pass over to Sally and welcome you to joining us, Sally.
Thank you very much. I just fire ahead. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about learning from the sort of wider equalities fields and disability fields, but my particular background is mostly around disability, but also some around wider equality issues as well. So I'm going to kick off by just saying a bit about, obviously, since the pandemic started, there has been an assumption that the vulnerable were basically people with underlying health conditions and or disabled people, often conflated as one and the same, even though not all disabled people have active health conditions or are unwell. And also, of course, older people who are also themselves very, thought of as being physically impaired, whether due to just frailty associated with old age or for disability of other kinds. And this, as far as governments are concerned, largely is still the case. Is very much, in terms of their policy, all about clinical status and what that means for clinical risk, with the main task being to build clinical resilience, and the way to do that being via vaccination. That's a very, a high level sort of caricature, but I think that's a kind of general thrust of what they're doing. So the impact on these groups has obviously been absolutely dire. The statistics confirm this, although of course what was very worrying is that data isn't really being collected anymore. And in fact, quite a lot of it started disappearing pretty early on. But just to give you a flavour, almost 60% of those people who died so far in the pandemic were disabled people, and millions of disabled people experienced hardship and isolation, were left unsupported and unprotected. And we saw it wasn't just around the clinical response, obviously, it was about the collapse of the social care system, in as much as it hadn't already collapsed. Things like do not resuscitate notices being issued without people's consent, and surveys carried out by disability organisations, particularly those led by disabled people themselves, that revealed a kind of mental health catastrophe. So, there does feel a bit like we're under attack. But conversely, it occurred to me that it doesn't necessarily seem to mean that governments in the UK are anti-disabled people. In fact, you could argue they are very keen to create more of us because of what they're not doing around long COVID. Because that's what's happening. We have an ongoing state of affairs whereby more people are becoming long-term disabled because of failure to control infection spread. So I'm going to just say a little bit about what disables people with impairments, because I do think, and then I'll explain why I think this is relevant to clinical risk and other kinds of risk. So the usual response, if you ask, so what is a disabled person? Well, there's somebody who's got some kind of medical condition. It could be physical, could be sensory, could be intellectual, and it's about clinical status. And that's kind of what's the traditional view of what disability is about. And it's known in the disability world, you may have come across this as the medical model of disability. And what that says effectively is that the disability is caused by something to do with the individual. And the way to sort that out is for doctors, others, and so on to treat or ideally cure it, adjust the disabled person to fit society, not society to fit the disabled person. And in the disability world, there's a thing called the social model, which has kind of come up, it came up in the 1980s, in fact, in response, in fact, opposition to this model. And what that says is that it isn't necessarily anything to do with the person's condition that causes them to be disabled, disadvantaged, unequal. It's about the barriers that the way society is structured impact on people who have impairments. And those barriers can be removed. So it's a very different way of understanding kind of what causes somebody to be disabled and unequal. I'm just going to say a little bit about what those are. And as I do, what these social barriers mean, it may be worth just thinking about, well, how might that apply in the case of COVID and responses to the pandemic? So the social model says that what causes a person who has an impairment to be disabled is, first and foremost, attitudes. Attitudes that if you're this kind of a person, if you've got these kinds of features, therefore you can't do things you are maybe aren't capable, you're infantilized, patronized, maybe you're tragic and heroic, but whatever you are, you're not normal, you're not equal, and attitudes that fail to understand the nature of barriers or consider them to be important is what disables us. The second, and I think really important kind of barrier in this context are environmental barriers, by which obviously in the disability world, we mean things like lack of ramps, poor lighting, poor signage, car parking being a long way away. It can be anything to do, it could be lack of quiet space, because different forms of people with different kinds of impairments need different kinds of environments. And very clearly in the COVID context, the environmental barrier is about the quality of air and exposure. There are others as well, which I won't dwell on, but they also, I think, apply. There are barriers around communications, about what is communicated, how it's communicated. And in the case of COVID, that clearly applies to misinformation. Transport accessibility is another one, and extra costs is another one. So when you sort of think about that, I think that provides us with a very kind of different way into understanding the nature of inequality that COVID provides. The other thing to point out is that these kinds of barriers don't just apply to disabled people. They apply to women. There are areas, for example, that are unsafe for women to go. Same with Black and minority ethnic groups. Communication barriers can arise for people whose first language isn't English. So these are basically, it's a model which talks about the kinds of ways in which society is structured and how that impacts on people who it doesn't accommodate. And I think what we're seeing now is that a lot of people are not accommodated by the new normal that has been created. So thinking about the nature of inequality that's been spawned by COVID and more specifically now responses to it, I would say that it's essentially two key and different kinds of risk. And one of the things that's interesting, I think, and challenging is that whereas sometimes those kinds of risk are associated with protected characteristics, as in the equality groups under the Equality Act, so different groups who are, because of their personal characteristics, they are protected. But some are not to do with that at all. And so clinical risk obviously is about that to some in as much as it's about features to do with your clinical makeup. So to that extent, it is a medical thing. It is about risk around that kind of an issue, and whether that risk is always mitigated. And of course, the mitigation for that kind of risk is about making people more resilient clinically. And what we've seen, as Lara was talking about, as well, is things around vaccination, and is basically the means of doing that, despite the many limitations that we now know there exist to vaccinations, that protection wanes after even a few weeks on occasions, but certainly a few months, and that it doesn't provide necessarily complete or even good protection against new variants that continue to come in waves. Then we have exposure risk, which is the other key area type of risk, because clinical risk without exposure risk isn't risk. That's part of the challenge here about how we tackle it. And exposure risk is basically an environmental risk or barrier as per the social model. Unsafe environments are inaccessible, and they effectively disable people who have no choice but to go into them, or effectively can't go into them because they're unsafe. And the importance of that kind of risk, though, is that it isn't just necessarily to do with people who are at clinical risk. It's also to do with people who aren't at any clinical risk, but have to go into unsafe environments very frequently and are exposed to frequent infection and reinfection. Because what we do know is that the more times you get infected, the more your risks are of long-term damage and long COVID. So that's to do with the environment that you're in, not anything to do with you personally. And we also, clearly, the mitigations for that kind of risk are different. They are the things that Lara was talking about around the types of masks that work and the ones that, bearing in mind that not all do, and fit is really important too. And it is about the quality of the air and the various sort of new technologies that we now have, or they're much more common anyway, in order to deal with that. And so what we also, I suppose, is worth acknowledging is that attitudes underpin all of this. And some of the attitudes that we've seen, I mean, I can say as a disabled person myself, who's also at clinical risk, I've had a lifetime of terrible attitudes. I've seen some pretty awful stuff and been subjected to a lot of it myself. But in a sense, what happened with the pandemic was it really kind of came out the woodwork. And I'm sure all of you saw a lot of the kind of stuff around, oh, well, it's only older people and disabled people, you know, people with underlying health conditions who are dying or having a problem. So, hey, it doesn't matter. You know, this has now become quite entrenched, I think, in public attitudes. Again, not necessarily always that explicit, but it certainly seems to be what is informing policy. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So, I'm thinking about who is at risk. As I say, it's therefore these two. There is people who have a clinical risk, but it's also people at highest exposure risk. And just before I move off this topic, it's worth reflecting on how the exposure risk actually does, in some ways, more affect people with certain protected characteristics than others, because of prevalence in the sorts of workforces where there is greater exposure. And so it may be that in, say, healthcare workforces, teaching professions, social care workforces, those kinds of workforces that have a lot of face-to-face interaction with a lot of people. But you might also argue people who are providing support for people with regard to public transport for those who've got restricted mobility. You know, these are people who are coming into contact with a lot of, who are very exposed, and yet the makeup of those professions might be more likely that women would be working in them, or maybe Black and minority ethnic groups. So there you start to have a different kind of driver for inequalities experienced by other inequality groups. I very briefly want to touch on the latest news in Scotland that has come out this week, because I think it ramps up the new league, the nature of attack on vulnerable people, but also people working in those frontline professions, notably social care. We have new guidance, in fact, the withdrawal of guidance happening tomorrow, but also new directions for people working in social care settings that will mean that the element of choice as to wear a mask beyond what is recommended by extremely out-of-date guidance that is based on droplet and splash type measures and contact with blood and bodily fluids and hand hygiene, none of which is relevant particularly to aerosol spread. It is, unless that applies, people will have people working in that, and also potentially visitors, and I don't even know about people who are using the service themselves, will not have be able to choose to wear a mask, even if, you know, there's no personal choice is being removed as to whether you do that. And so what that means, in effect, is that we are moving from a policy that was do what you like, but oh, remember to protect the vulnerable, to justify why you should protect the vulnerable. And if you can't, you have to take your mask off. And this has made wearing a mask to protect vulnerable people, your colleagues, and yourself, an act of defiance against the promotion of what I can only describe as a eugenic policy. Because if you have extremely clinically vulnerable people concentrated into care homes or even prisoners in their own home, You have people coming in who are being told that they need to work, even if they're infected, so long as they can still function. No work, no possibility of protecting yourself, no possibility of people, of so-called carers protecting you. Then you don't have to be an expert or terribly clever to work out the obvious consequences of how that's going to play out. The worrying thing is a lot of that will be hidden because the data isn't there. And where it concerns care homes, these are people who I can just hear it now. Well, how are you going to know that they died of that rather than of COVID, rather than the fact that they were going to die anyway? So I think this is, I can tell you that people in Scotland are, I think the word is distraught about what's happening. The COVID Action Scotland, which is what Zero COVID Scotland is now calling itself, is in the process of trying to launch a campaign around this. I would also say, watch out, because this may not be what the UK government guidance says yet, but I think it could well be coming your way. So just to sum up, in terms of learning, a lot of what has happened and has echoes learning from the disability field. And I think learning from the disability field is very helpful here. Government policy is firmly stuck in a medical model around individuals' clinical status and risk. And even then, not adequately, because most people who are at clinical risk, and clinical risk isn't just about immunosuppression, it's about all kinds of loss of capacity. Another hit is going to kind of knock you over the edge. And that has never been acknowledged. And a lot of people have risk, which is high, but not at highest. It's not even the people who are in the shielding group, other people have risk too. And many of those people are not eligible for boosters, and most are not eligible for antivirals. Notably, environmental barriers have in the form of unsafe environments. All learning about that seems to have just disappeared. There have been vague attempts in Scotland, which is where I'm based, but none of them have got very far. And there's just no recognition of the importance of air quality. But we need to get into focus on those kinds of barriers too. And that's where I think there is possibly room in the campaigning around the COVID situation to draw on some of the approaches in the disability world. With all the learning on aerosol spread, on air quality, on types of masks, on the limitations of vaccination, as well as their usefulness, on the long-term widespread damage from infection, even mild infection, of increased risk from reinfection, and on the real impact on younger people and children as well, and that anyone and everyone is therefore at risk of long COVID and serious long-term consequences, even if it isn't a serious acute infection. It's like it never happened. But what we're seeing is that Build Back Better seems to mean going back to what was there before the pandemic, like the pandemic never happened at all and isn't still here. We're seeing removal of data, the airbrushing out of existence, because if that's what effectively removing data is going to do. But also airbrushing out of existence the people whose mere existence exposes the fakery of that narrative. And that's kind of what we're up against. I think there's we've got a really big battle on our hands. It's deeply scary what's happening, and we've all got to try and fight back on this, because where this leads, it isn't just a scary place for the likes of people like me who are at clinical risk. It's a very scary place for others. Life expectancy is going to be cut, and meanwhile the health service is also collapsing. And in fact, this is a good way to collapse the healthcare system. It's about making it unsafe so people can't use it and don't go there. But on what is also the case is that we now do have the tools. We do have the knowledge and the learning, and there's more happening, more innovation across the globe all the time, which tells us that a safe and inclusive new normal that maximizes everyone's freedom is now possible. And that, I think, I hope, is our shared goal. Thank you.
Thank you. And solidarity, of course, to everybody in Scotland and everywhere, really. But yeah, I'm gonna stop recording now, and we can head on to a Q&A section.